Well, hello and welcome to City Future Success Centre seminar series. My name is Parry Hussaini and I'd like to acknowledge that today we're meeting on the traditional land of the Aboriginal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present, also to anyone, any First Nation people joining us here today. If you're joining online, please make sure to mute yourself and turn off your cameras. Once we get to Q&A, you're welcome to turn them back on. And if you had any questions, you could also put them in the chat box and we'll be monitoring the chats for questions. Now I'd like to hand over to Professor Hazel Easthope to introduce today's speaker.
Everyone, welcome to the seminar series. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Edgar Liu. He is a City Futures stalwart, has done many interesting research projects. Today, he's talking to us about how LGBTQ+ migrants navigate formal and informal care options as they age. So a very interesting topic, and please come up and tell us all about it.
Thank you very much, Hazel, and welcome everybody. We chose this day because we got Sisters in Mardi Gras parade happen on the weekend. So happy Mardi Gras, everybody who's online. So in a previous seminar that happened almost 2 years ago, I did propose that based on previous research that we did, from a policy perspective, Australia tends to employ a cultural blindness when it comes to aging-related services. And if you want to know about how we actually came to that conclusion, you can go and watch the old seminar. But that finding actually aligns with a lot of international and academic literature that talks about diversity more generally is often examined in a siloed manner. So it can either be this thing, you can either be of a cultural background, or you have a disability, or you have a particular gender and sexual identity. So most of them don't actually recognize that, well, like most of us, we tick multiple boxes at any point in time. But that is slowly changing. So there is an increasing recognition of what we call intersectionality, for example, which recognizes that diversity happens in multiple different ways. And that's not just within the academic literature that you can see on your left, but also more slowly within the policy setting, the government setting. The picture on the right is, for example, the Victorian Inclusion and Equity Statement that provides not only a definition of intersectionality, but also then go on to talk a little bit more about how that should be put into practice more generally. But of the two things that I'm really going to talk about today, which is on the next slide, for people of culturally and diverse background, for example, they often experience aging in a very different manner, either because of their diet, because of their lifestyles, but there's also different preferences in terms of how they actually access care and services. For particular cultural groups, those from Asia, those from the Middle East, and particularly also Southern Europe, also in Latin America, there's often an assumption that there's a preference for kin-based care. So care is provided by family members, both immediate family, but also the extended family. But our topic, which is about migrants' experiences, I want to explore how the migration process actually influences that access, particularly if you don't migrate or you haven't migrated with family members in tow. So if that's your preference, how does it actually change your experiences of care or your access to care? Literature also highlights other challenges, including language barriers, which I'll go into a little bit more, and also unfamiliarity with the care and health system, particularly if you're a more recent migrant, you don't know how things actually work. Some of the things that our participant highlighted, for example, was that, I need to go and see a specialist. So I can just go and see a specialist, but here in Australia, you actually need to go and see a GP first and get a referral. So those kind of subtle differences in practice may actually impede on how you actually access those kind of care. onto the other side, people who people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community may also have different health and care needs and requirements. The very well-known HIV and AIDS epidemic, for example, may mean that there might be particular health needs of individuals. It might also reduce the social network, so it reduces the access to informal care support for a particular age group of the community. Family estrangement may also impact on access to kin-based care. So you might not actually be getting along with your family, or that they might have rejected you. So you don't actually have that option of relying on family in order to receive that care or provide that care. The Royal Commission also talked a lot about experiences or perception of discrimination, and that's discrimination of many different kinds, so racism, homophobia, transphobia, that actually precludes a lot of people from wanting to make use of formal services and rely instead a lot more on informal care options. So with all of that background in mind, we were very lucky to receive support from the Aging Futures Institute here at UNSW through a small seed grant from a couple of years ago. And you can see that people who are part of the team there were interdisciplinary team, so from clinician nurses, health researchers. We also had in-kind support from two very significant organizations, being the from New South Wales and also the National Association of People with HIV Australia, who helped us recruit our participants. Aims of the project was to actually understand how people actually navigate formal and informal care environment, the care landscape, when they are of a very particular intersection when it concerns diversity. And of course, the usual academic thing, how do you actually make things better by making recommendations to policy and also to practice. Analytically, though, we followed the kind of proposition put forward by Davis and Sorkin almost 10 years ago now, when they made very clear distinction between the concept of cultural sensitivity, so the acknowledgement that there is diversity, but also the concept of cultural competency. So you actually have the skills to make use of that knowledge and then respond appropriately. It's not good enough just to say, yeah, I know you're different, but I don't know what to do with that information. So that is the basis of our analysis there. We used the typical mixed methods approach, starting with secondary and spatial analysis of secondary data, coupled with semi-structured interviews with the care industry and also people with lived experience. And we set selection criteria to demonstrate a very particular intersection, being that they have to be of a certain age group. So we distinguish between a middle age group and an older 50+ age group. They also have to identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community within care, which letter they are, so long as they identify as such. They had to have been born in Asia and migrated to Australia, because we wanted to understand that migration experience. And then they have to have lived in Australia for at least 3 years, so that they are intending to stay, but also have some familiarity with the society and also with the care system. But starting with the quant aspect, so the rest of the research team have been running a gay Asian male survey for quite a long time, for over a decade. And by 2021, the focus shifted from Sydney to New South Wales more broadly. And of course, 2021 was the COVID year. The collection method also changed to online, so it actually had a much wider reach compared to previously. It's the most comprehensive survey of that particular intersection in this country. Even though it was focused on New South Wales, we actually had participants outside of New South Wales as well. The two other data sets that we looked at was the Gen Aged Care data set that you can download freely from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. And we only looked at two very specific data sets within that package. So those concerning aged care providers, so these are the residential care providers, service, the institution where you need to move into in order to receive the service, and also home care providers. So these are the outreach services that come to you when you continue to live at home. And then, the usual census analysis. So what we did with the first survey data set was we reanalyzed, because the report had already been published, but we reanalyzed the data set based on age differentiation. And we published a profile of how they actually differ by different age groups. You can see on the right there. But the main findings was that the pathways of how they actually come to live in Australia were quite different. And of course, associated with that, the length of residence in Australia, how they identify, the relationship status, and all of those things are listed on there. But of most, I guess, surprising to us was their understanding and the knowledge and practice of sexual health, with the understanding that the 50+ age group was the group that experienced the early onset of the HIV pandemic. And it was that group that had the least amount of sexual health knowledge or safe-sex practice, partly because they were more likely to be in a long-term relationship, but even when they are having sexual experiences outside of the relationship, they were also less likely to practice safety, which is something that we didn't really quite understand. Moving on to the other data sets though, so the two of the two aged care data sets, both of them were able, so care providers were able to self-nominate and self-report special services that they provide to care recipients. And of the home care providers, they were able to tick 9 of those boxes that you can see on your left. And for residential care providers, they are able to offer 3 additional services, ranging from veteran statuses, Indigenous people, dementia care, all of those things. And of the particular intersection that we're interested in, we're only focusing on the 2 that are highlighted in the middle as just a demonstration. But what did the data actually say? Of the almost 1,000 residential care providers, only 1 in 10 is able to meet both of those, that particular intersection at the same time within the same provider. Whereas home care providers, about half, is able to do the same. When looking at it more broadly, residential care providers were more likely to be more specialized, particularly that they tend to tick fewer of those boxes, usually no more than 4, whereas home care providers were a lot more flexible in their service offerings, tend to tick more of at the higher end numbers. But that doesn't necessarily explain a lot. So we've delved a little bit more into the only spatial data that was available in those data sets and also in the survey, which was the postcode of which the services were available. So we did a whole bunch of maps like you would normally expect and overlaid it with survey data, with census data. And I'm not going to go too much into it because we produced a story map that you can see through the link and the QR code on the right. That is also where you can actually look at the age differentiated profile that I mentioned earlier. But given all that, how do people actually experience these intersections and the challenges that comes with diversity? Starting with reflections by the industry. So as a CGRAN, our capacity was a bit more limited. So we interviewed 3 industry representatives, 1 being a home care provider, and the 2 being advocacy group and the peak body. We largely focus on what they do on a day-to-day basis. So how do they actually provide care? How do they set the policies and governance? How do they retain the workforce? And whether they do things such as provide training and advocacy and how changing regulations and policies. And also the longer term reflections of how the health and care sector and social services more generally has been changing in relation to diversity and intersectionality. Without going into too much detail again, most of them recognize that there is a need to highlight intersectionality being a significant knowledge gap within the sector because no one knows how to deal with it. Primarily because diversities like that is reflected in the literature, they're often dealt with in silos, like the different tick boxes they're able to do, that I can do this, or I can do that thing, or I can do that thing. So when we very openly ask them, where do you think we sit in that spectrum of sensitivity and competence, all of them without skipping a beat, it's like, oh yeah, we're definitely very sensitive. We don't know what to do with it, even though human services is our business. We should be looking after the individuals who use our services, but we don't know how to do that appropriately. So how is that actually experienced in real life? We interviewed 17 people. There's a skew towards the younger middle age group, 11 in the 35 to 49 age group. That's partly the outcome of our recruitment strategy. So actually all of them were recruited via social media, so LinkedIn and private space, Facebook groups operated by the two in-kind partners. So that's how we kind of reach those individuals. The brackets that you see there are the actual age range of participants, so 35 to older 74 at the time of the interview, so that was 2 years ago now. We focus on the different topics that you see on the left there. So how did they actually come to live in Australia? How do they actually see the health requirements? What are the challenges in receiving appropriate care? And also what their longer term plans are and how they think those could be appropriately met. Despite the skew towards the younger age group, the length of time that they lived here were generally quite spread out. So we have a diversity of experience in terms of how Australia actually, responds to a diverse community, ranging from having lived here for just 4 years to over to 50 years for one particular participant. Most of them identified as gay at the time of the interview. And I need to stress that it was at the time of the interview because people often change how they identify, and that also changes how they perceive their healthcare needs and also how they go about seeking services. So both of the queer and trans participants, for example, they were very open about having previously identified as gay, but as their identities change, their requirements have also changed. We were hoping to get as much diversity in terms of place of origin at the very least. So we had a policy of a maximum 3 participants from any place of origin. And so you can see the list of place of origins that we have up there, with Eastern and Southeastern Asia quite well represented, and to some extent the Southern subcontinent as well, but not so much Central and Western Asia. And also to reflect that diversity, we asked if people wanted to be interviewed in a different language. 3 people said so. We were very lucky to have a research assistant who could speak both of those languages and were able to do those interviews and write up notes for us as well. So what did they actually say? The pathways to Australia were very diverse. It ranged from having migrated as children with their family, so having grown up here and become very familiar with our society and our systems, to having moved here to take up education and then stayed on or to move here in later life. Despite that kind of diversity of pathway, though, all of them place very strong emphasis on their cultural identity and their cultural background, and name very significant contrast between their places of origin and Australia, particularly when it comes to acceptance of diversity, as you can see from the first quote there. And that in some ways influenced how they perceive their care needs and how they actually go about seeking care requirements. The difference was particularly obvious or prominent for those who have a partner of a different cultural background, as you can see in the second quote there, where, despite having this particular participant, for example, they moved to Australia as a young child. Despite that extended periods of stay here, they often still identify through their cultural background that, I am Asian, so most of my care requirements should be taken care of within the family from a kin-based system. Noting that of the 17 participants, only 2 have family members living in Sydney. Everyone else had family members living interstate or overseas. So despite this want or preference for kin-based care, or at least in-person kin-based care, that is not obviously a regular option for many of them. While they understand that Australia is a very accepting society, most of them made very clear distinctions of how they actually go about seeking services. The majority of our participants live in the inner suburbs or the middle ring suburbs of Sydney, with only 1 living in the outer suburbs and 2 living part-time outside of Sydney in a nearby regional town. And so most of them talk about, if I need a GP and speak my language, it's easy to find. But all of them not all of them, but the vast majority of them make very clear distinction when it comes to health requirements relating to their LGBTQ status, particularly when it comes to sexual health. The vast majority seek a separate service, so there's a very clear, distinct pathway in terms of what they see as general health and also LGBTQ health. Most of them go to a service called A-Test, which is a free service run by the Sydney local health district, specializing in HIV and sexually transmitted infection testing. So they often make very clear distinctions of doing that. But when you need to do that or when you want to do that, geography comes into play. So those who live further out and those who live part-time outside of Sydney, they often have trouble finding appropriate service in the local area. So all of them actually still come to Sydney, to the inner suburbs of Sydney, to access that part, at the very least, that part of the health requirements. Geography aside, there are other challenges. While telehealth is becoming more and more common, the 2 who live part-time outside of Sydney, they found it very difficult to find appropriate resources where they are, not just from a GP perspective, other kind of health and care and support requirements. And then going back to the earlier point about language proficiency, for all of them, speaking English was not necessarily an issue on a day-to-day basis or even on a professional basis, as this particular participant said, very fine, in a working environment, in a day-to-day social environment. But, having been used to describing the symptoms or the health in a very different language, they then become stressed. Like, what if I tell the doctor the wrong thing? Do I get the wrong kind of care? I should probably check up and see a translation online beforehand. Day-to-day ailments, that's fine, but if you're in an emergency situation, that becomes particularly stressful. And then there are the longer term views. All of them cannot see an appropriate level of support as they continue to get older. This part of the interview is quite interesting because most of them made very clear distinctions of what they see as Asian-based care services and then the LGBTQ-based services, because obviously those 2 things never meet in their mind, and also reflected within the literature and in the policy as well, that continuation of that kind of siloed approach in terms of how services are provided and received by participants. And And they also made a lot of assumptions on what those services would be. So if they choose to use an Asian-based service, then obviously they would think that I need to go back into the closet because they are conservative and they would not be accepting of my identity. And likewise, if they choose to go to the LGBTQ service, then they're more likely to be the only non-white, non-Caucasian person there. And there's often an assumed racism within those kind of services. So how do you choose between those two things as you continue to get older and when you apply those kind of things? Part of those perception is perhaps based on an understanding of how the Australian care, particularly aged care system, is currently functioning. We rely a lot on transient workforce, short-term, casual-based workforce. We also rely quite a lot on migrant workforce, particularly from generally more conservative backgrounds. So a high proportion of our care workers, for example, come from the subcontinent or Muslim background who might not be accepting of particularly gender and sexual diversities. So this kind of pulled them back from wanting to access those services as well. The other side of it is that a lot of the aged care providers, so both residential-based and home-based, are run by a non-profit organization and also more specifically religious organization, which obviously has a very distinctive and negative history when it comes to accepting diversity. So that also pulls them back from wanting to use a lot of formal services. In lieu of those options, many try to cultivate informal networks in forms of things like logical family or expanded social network in order to find some mutual care help. Where they are able to, of course, they might not be able to in many instances. Or in more extreme cases, like you see at the bottom, they may choose to go home to their place of origin and seek kin-based care elsewhere and not in a society they've grown up in. This was relatively a minor view, so maybe 4 or 5 out of 17. But these are also the people who have not been open about themselves with their family members. So they would also need to go back into the closet in order to access those kind of kin-based support. Despite not, seeing a future in terms of the service suitability, there was a lot of optimism. I don't need it right now, but how I need it in 10, 15 years time, everything we will find magically happen for us. I don't know how it is, I don't know what it looks like, but it's magic. Everything will be fine. Some of that is predicated on changes in structures. So a lot of our interviews talked about the marriage equality plebiscite and the changing regulation being quite a significant catalyst in changing regulation, allowing them to be even bullish. Like the second quote there shows that, well, they have to take me, they can't discriminate me because it's a legal requirement, without really understanding how it would be like living socially within that environment with other people who might not be as accepting or openly accepting of their needs. So there's a knowledge gap between what we understand as cultural sensitivity and also cultural competency, both from a policy perspective and also from a practice perspective. This is despite when we asked the industry representatives, all of them highlighted that the aged care sector was the first human service sector in Australia to introduce a diversity framework back in 2017. So it's actually a pioneer within the social services and human service sector. But the critique is that because it needs to be applicable to a wide range of services, guidance generally is very high level. And so it takes a lot of different kinds of interpretation before it can become. It's also often not linked to available resources. So when there's guidance about inclusive language, and it's not necessarily directly linked to existing resources like the inclusive language cards that many governments nowadays produce and promote. Even on the stages of a lot of service providers, there's also a lack of resourcing in terms of how do they actually find appropriate training services? How do we actually support institutions like us in training our trainers to provide the appropriate level of care? Because at the moment, most of those training are not accredited, so we don't actually know the quality or the outcomes of those training as well. And so because of all those critique and those kind of drawbacks, the industry representatives found it very frustrating of how slow the implementation of that framework has been. By the time of the interview, which is more than 6 years after the introduction, they still thought that we were in the infancy of putting that into play. And of course, the aged care sector in Australia is also one of the ones that go through reform on a regular basis, or more regularly than others. And so, along with the healthcare sector more generally, we're slowly shifting towards what we call the person-centered care model, which is both good and a bad. Good in that you're more likely to access more customized and individualized service packages, but at the same time, one of the interviews talked about specific guidelines. So the diversity framework came with 3 specific sub-reports that focus on the requirements of people of culturally diverse background, LGBTQ people, and Aboriginal people as well. But their claim is that all of those will be slowly drawn back so that you can't actually access those specific guidance. I haven't found any evidence to suggest that that is actually the case, but that is the claim that we're actually drawing back on those kind of more specific guidance. The challenge of transient workforce remains in place, and that is particularly hard to overcome because, as the home care provider we interviewed said, well, we are a human service sector, but most providers continue to see competency and diversity as a unique selling point rather than part of the core business. So it is something that you need additional investment into to become a specialist rather than being part of your everyday core business. And with that framework continuing, it would be very difficult for businesses to continue to upskill their staff, particularly with strong competition from other providers in poaching, potentially poaching the staff that manage to train up. Very last line in conclusion, within the policy space and also within the practice space, siloing of diversity continues to exist. And that is also reflected in the lived experiences of our participants as well. So they're a very clear distinction of the care pathway that they need to take in order to meet very particular identity status. While most of our participants have a preference for aging in place, like most other of the general community, they're highly frustrated by the lack of options that there is in terms of moving into a care home, in terms of services coming to help them in their home. As I mentioned, cognitive competency continue to be seen as an add-on and not a part of the core business. Of the home care provider we interviewed, they very proudly highlighted that they have implemented the inclusion practice policy for at least 3 years. But in those 3 years, of the 2,000 plus clients that they actually look after, not one single person came up and told them, I am part of this community. Mostly because they haven't actually created a safe enough and comfortable enough environment for people to want to disclose that part of themselves. Because in that very large table that I showed you, LGBTQ identity, it's one of the few where you can't actually find out through administrative data. It requires self-disclosure in order for the person to receive the appropriate care, the kinds of support. So you're not creating a safe enough environment, a comfortable enough environment. It actually doesn't work, even though you have that policy practice And then the final usual recommendation that, of course, more guidance is required and more support is required in order for improvements to continue to be made. That's it.
Do we have questions?
Edgar, thank you for a really interesting and beautifully, as always, presented presentation. It's more a reflection than perhaps a question. I was wondering, as you're talking about the interviews, you interviewed people themselves about their preferences, their issues around care, and then some service providers. I was sort of wondering too, how much you think perhaps our broader culture around difference and diversity and acceptance. And I had the experience of visiting my mother in a nursing home for more than 7 years, and just I did sort of incidental observations during that time. And I know there were issues around the culture of people within the home, and not specifically to do with this issue that you're examining, but as you're talking, I was reflecting on that and just thinking about that, the broader cultural issues of the residents in homes, and whether you had any ideas about that, or whether that came up, and how you reflect on that perhaps.
Yeah, I think the Royal Commission, for example, they did talk about racism and different kinds of discrimination, and that's not limited to the service providers themselves. Right? Like you would have seen, might have come from other residents. In a residential care situation, it can be particularly challenging. Particularly, most people only go into those kind of institutions when they require higher levels of care. A lot of the times it might be dementia, it might be mental decline, so they may not be they might not recognize those kind of limitations as easily. For example, I did mention that a lot of our lived experience participants thought that there are particular catalysts like regulatory changes that would make these things happen. But that view wasn't actually shared by our industry interviews. They were more likely to say that all of these changes are more based on societal changes, which is a lot slower, which is a lot harder to come by. And so the appetite, to provide those kind of services, to meet those kind of services, in order for that to not be seen as an add-on, as a specialization, it's a much slower thing to come about, particularly when you're talking about other residents, which is not something that you can say, there's no accreditation for training your residents, for example. So the kind of divergent view in terms of how those changes will come about.
Picking up on that, so before Susan asked a question, you answered it. You partly answered my question, which is, what would it take for the service providers to elevate this from a nice to have to a core business issue? And you partly answered that by saying, well, they've said I don't think it's regulation. I think it's societal change.
Yeah.
What would it take to speed that up? I mean, is it about having a public campaign, or like what do you think could be done to make this happen faster?
Well, I mean, there can be top-down practices, right? So if you make inclusion and diversity part of the training that everyone has to undertake, for example, it might be part of a module of one course that you do, or it might be a special course that you do. If you make that part of the core of all the training that everyone has to go through, then that would probably help speed it up a little bit. One of the industry people that we interviewed, they actually provide that kind of training. But they have shifted their model so that everyone gets a customized syllabus instead of standard, which I didn't really understand. So they're kind of, if this is what you've come to us for, then we will give you this specific bits rather than give you all the bits that you need. And to me, that is sort of a backward move so that not everyone will understand the different requirements and you're just getting the bits that you want to have. So, there's, again, if there's more top-down change for that to happen, that will speed up the service provision, diversity, society. I mean, as you know, societal changes are quite hard to come by, right? So there can be public campaigns. There might be more subtle things like leadership showing that they actually support this kind of initiative. We're not in a particular good place right now, not as bad as some other places, when we're talking about needing to roll back DEI initiatives, for example, elsewhere. But, if there are leadership higher up to show that, well, this is not actually the case, we should be doing the exact opposite, then, we're actually showing that that should be, must be going forward.
More questions?
Oh.
Go ahead, Ali.
Hello. Hello. That was a really great presentation. Thank you, Ed. I was just, wait, can you hear me?
Can't hear you, Ali.
Mm,
Maybe pop it in the chat.
no.
We had this issue last time too. We had
I'll
this
put it
issue
in.
last time as well.
Online.
Maybe, yeah.
But it out there.
Maybe. Yeah. Sounds good.
Right now, Ali.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Was that a yes? Sorry.
Yes.
Yay. Hello. I said before, that was a really great presentation. Thank you. I was just curious about, I know the sample was, small in terms of the age differences, but I was just wondering if you noticed a difference in kind of responses and what they were between like the under 50s, the 35 to 50 and then over 50.
I think the biggest, the most obvious difference between the two age groups was how they see the future requirements. Obviously, for the 50+ age group, they think that it's going to come a lot closer sooner than the other age groups. So it was actually quite difficult for the middle age group to articulate what they see their future needs are. Even though the quote that I showed you about, everything will just magically happen was a 50+ person. But that kind of sentiment was more likely expressed by the younger age group because they don't know what their needs are at the moment and they don't know what their needs will be. And so they can't actually say what kind of support they will need. I think that was the biggest difference that I noticed. Partnership, though, was also another thing. They just assume that if they have a partner, then it's a lot easier to find supported services. Even though they also understand that it's a lot harder to go into a residential care situation, for example. Because one, you need two people, but also that you are then obviously very different to most of the other residents there. Those are the two things that kind of stand out.
Oh, that's an excellent answer. Thank you. I do have another question if I just can't see the room, if nobody else
Sure,
has
go
a hand
ahead.
up. I was just curious, and I may have missed this when you were introducing the sample, but in terms of like like diversity and gender and stuff, obviously it's a very mixed bag, but I know a lot of queer research can tend to be populated by cis men.
Yeah.
What are your perspectives on how this, was there any influences in terms of gender in that aspect? I may have missed it. Sorry if I did.
Well, in the kind of recruitment or kind of material, we did say men. So that's why vast majority of the sample are cisgender men. The trans person we interviewed, I actually had to specifically seek out because I wanted a different perspective. And yeah, she talked a lot about difficulty of being a trans person. And I think that's why she placed so much emphasis on the regulatory change. So she has lived as a trans woman for over 20 years, and for the longest of that time, while she can appear as a woman, she was not legally a woman. And so she goes and seeks services all dressed up, long dress, makeup, and then present her ID, oh, it says you are a man. Then there are quite a lot of challenges when it comes to those kind of differences, which I think is why she places that much emphasis on the regulatory change that as soon as I came in, she just went to the GP to say, can you sign this document so that I can go and change my driver's license and passport immediately? But I think her longer term plan, and this is obviously very specific to her individual situation, her longer term plan was that she would move into a care home. And she was very adamant that, she was one who was very adamant that they can't discriminate me, but she also understands that she would be very different compared to most other residents that would live there. And so there's this kind of sentiment of holding back, like, do I go in as a woman, in dresses all the time in makeup, or do I need to dress a bit more androgynously, gender neutral, in order to fit in? And so, yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why we specifically, sought a different perspective, even though in the recruitment process we specifically said it had to be so gender does play a big role. Her situation also was that she lives in the apartment next door to her elderly parents, and she is their carer. She has a sister, so she is not the only daughter, but she is the carer. But the parents are not accepting, so she can't go and provide the care as a woman. She has to provide the care as a man. So the individual situations can be quite challenging, which I guess again goes back to my point that that's why she thinks you need to have much stronger regulation to recognize differences, to basically force people to recognize differences in order for change to happen.
I think we have some questions. Thank you so much, Edgar.
Thank you.
Just as a reminder, our next seminar will be held in 2 weeks, and Dr. Caitlin Buckle is presenting her research on the drivers and management of population growth in regional cities. Have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Thank you.